Hi, and welcome to the late fall edition of the teacher webinar for STEM Jobs Magazine. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ellen Egley. I am the Director of Education here at STEM Jobs.
And I am Jill Catelli, and I contribute lesson plans to some of the articles that go in the magazine.
And basically our goal for this webinar is to walk you through the issue, give you an overview of the articles and the lesson plans that are included, so that you know how to approach it in your classroom and how to teach it. And we want to give you a little bit of insight into what we would do if we were teaching this in the classroom, what points we would emphasize, that kind of thing. So we hope you find this to be a valuable resource. And again, if you have any questions at all, or any ways we can help you, please feel free to contact us at info@stemjobs.com. So we'll go ahead and dig right in. Just like we have for the last year or so, the late fall issue starts out by addressing a STEM myth that is pretty prevalent. So this myth is that STEM professionals work in a lab experimenting on animals or in a cubicle analyzing data. So this is a myth that I think is very prevalent among preteens and teens when they think of STEM careers. Unfortunately, they think about working in a lab, you're torturing mice for some reason, or you're an accountant working in spreadsheets, and that's kind of their very narrow view of what a STEM career actually is.
Yes.
So what we try to do in this issue and in every issue of the magazine is show students that there are actually STEM careers in every industry, including the industries that kids are really passionate about. So things like social media, music, sports, fitness, fashion, entertainment, all rely on STEM professionals to function. So STEM doesn't have to be boring. STEM doesn't have to involve working in a lab or in spreadsheets exclusively. There are incredible careers out there in every industry. So that's the myth that we address at the beginning. And then as far as the industries go for the late fall issue, we look at first emergency response as we continue with the ABCs of STEM. Then we look at forestry careers, then geology, and we end this issue with hydroponics. So if you have your magazine in front of you, we start out with the article STEM to the Rescue, where we interviewed a gentleman named Mark Swanson, who has basically held every job title in the job spread that follows, and is now the Deputy Director of the Department of Public Protection in a county in Florida that is home to Daytona Beach. So what I found really interesting about Mark's job is that he has to deal with all of the public protection issues that any other county would have to deal with, especially a county in Florida, so they have to worry about things like hurricanes, floods, all of those things, as well as beach safety, because they have such a huge influx of tourists to Daytona Beach. So I think his position within Florida is very unique in that he has to deal with a lot of things, such as the police department, the fire department, beach safety, as well as providing services to coroners and things like that whenever there are any criminal acts. So Mark talks a lot about his experience as an EMT, as a firefighter, and how that led him to his current career. What I found the most interesting was how many certifications he is required to earn and then maintain to have his position and to stay qualified for his position. So I think as educators we talk a lot about inspiring students to become lifelong learners, and Mark to me is kind of the embodiment of that, who is continually undergoing additional training to be better at his job and to help the people that he supervises be better at their jobs as well. And then if you take a look at the emergency job spread after that, there are the typical ones that I think we think of as those jobs you want when you're a little kid, firefighter, police officer. And there are some that really surprised me as well. Things like a disaster response technician. You don't really think about who goes in and cleans up after some sort of disaster, whether it be man-made or natural. When chemicals are spilled, people need to be trained in how to clean those up responsibly so that they don't harm people or the environment. So we go all the way from forest fighter to an emergency room doctor. And as we've talked about before, we really at STEM Jobs feel that everything from a high school diploma plus some training all the way through the gamut up to a doctorate degree, those are all relevant pathways to get to a great career. We don't believe that one pathway is better than any other.
Right.
And we really encourage students to think about what they want to do first and then pursue the training that is right for that career, instead of kind of doing it backwards and thinking, oh, I have to get a bachelor's degree and then I'll figure it out. So as teachers, you are the stewards of those conversations. So we hope that the content of the magazine can empower you to have those conversations in a really meaningful way with your students. So after emergency response, I was astounded at the number of different forestry careers that we were able just to feature in the articles. And I actually had to turn down some other people because we simply didn't have room in print to feature everyone. So I had the very outdated view of forestry.
Yeah, I definitely did too.
The lumberjack wearing red flannel for some reason. I blame those brawny paper towel commercials.
Sure.
And wielding, a chainsaw or an axe. And that was forestry in my mind. But once we actually started reaching out to professionals and saw the incredible careers that were out there and how diverse those careers are, I was really surprised. And I hope your students are too. So the first gentleman we interviewed is Grant, and he is the director of woodlands for a timber company. So this is kind of the more typical job that we might think of, where he actually does a ton of math to figure out, based on samples, when certain stands of timber will be ready for harvesting, if they can meet their clients' demands, what their profit margin will be, things like that. So that's a really interesting job that goes beyond, just being a lumberjack to the actual science behind how do you make forestry sustainable. I think the days of, clear cutting a field without any plan for the future are behind us. And forestry has actually become a very sustainable, eco-focused industry. And that sort of surprised me. And I think was a relief, because so often we think about, how many trees were cut down to make my paper towels or to make my napkins, and it feels wasteful. But the industry has really refocused on sustainability. And has kind of been a leader in that front, so that's been really interesting. And then on the math side, the lesson plan that goes with this article focuses specifically on sampling techniques and has students look through different sampling techniques, pick the one they want to use, and then actually analyze a small area of forest, either hopefully on school property or in their community, and make some predictions based on their sampling. And my favorite part that I think really ties into the math practices is they have to justify why their sampling method was the best of all the available sampling methods, and why they think their predictions are more accurate than those of the other groups. And that's a piece that I think a lot of teachers struggle with how to do effectively, the building a logical argument and justifying your reasoning. So it's a lesson plan that really does a lot of that for you. So then the next article in the magazine, we interviewed a man named Dan Brown, and I think his forestry career was one of the most surprising for me as we were putting the magazine together. So he works for a university, and his job there is to help them actually make use of any trees that need to be cut down due to disease or construction projects and repurpose that lumber in really artistic ways. So he actually has students at the university in the forestry program help to determine which trees could be repurposed, helps him dry them and prepare them for the next stage, where art students and local artisans are able to actually craft products out of the wood that would have ended up in a landfill otherwise. Because if you think of college campuses, how many flyers are hung on trees using staples, using nails, things like that. And those defects caused by metal being in the wood prevent the wood from being able to use by a traditional timber company. So his team actually takes that wood that would be wasted otherwise and makes beautiful artwork out of it.
Very cool work.
And you can tell it really married his two passions of forestry and art in an incredibly meaningful way. So I think that's another career that shows that you don't have to sit in a lab, you don't have to work in spreadsheets all day. If you are a STEM professional, you can be creative, you can be artistic, and the combination of STEM and the arts is such a natural fit. And unfortunately, I think too often as teachers we fail to emphasize that and to integrate the arts as often as possible. So then our final forestry article,
there's 2 more.
Oh, you're right. We're on number 3.
Sorry.
I apologize. We interviewed Jason, and he also works for a university, but he manages thousands of acres for the university for multiple purposes. So part of it is harvested and sold, and that pays for a lot of research projects and different things, which is really interesting, and he's very focused on doing that in a really sustainable way. And then they also use some of the acres for their research students to go out and do a lot of meaningful hands-on research and work in the forested acres.
Very cool.
So again, a career I never even thought about existing.
I never really thought of forestry, period. I really didn't. And these articles were so fascinating to me. Like, it was just a really cool number of things that can be done.
Agreed. And that's why we, I think in past issues we focused a lot on those industries that students were already really passionate about. And this year we are still doing some of that, but we're also trying really hard to elevate other industries that kids either never thought about or have discounted because they think they already know what it's about and it's not for them. So I think this issue is a really nice example of that. So our last interviewee for forestry, now that we're there, is with Dr. Emily Huff. And what she does is actually an assistant professor of human dimensions of forestry. But she is not just an assistant professor. She also gets to do a lot of research studies, gets published in journals, does a lot of research in professional journals and things like that. So again, I think students need to understand that teaching, especially at the secondary and college level, is a STEM profession that often gets discounted. But that if you are a professor or an assistant professor, you don't just teach. You provide other services for your college or university as well that usually involve research and things like that. So for Emily, she got to combine her passions for helping people with her passions for forestry, and gets to help guide students to figure out what they want to do. And the title of this article is Finding a Career That Fits. And the reason we chose that is because she was given great advice by a professor she had as a student who said, find a career that fits the lifestyle you want. So if you're not a morning person, don't study birds.
That was very cool.
And that, I think, really changed her perspective and changed her path, because she really had to do some introspection and figure out what lifestyle she wanted and what career would allow that lifestyle to happen. So then in our forestry job spread, my favorite job title is Timber Cruiser, because personally I had no idea what that meant before we started researching it. And I think it would be really fun to have Timber Cruiser on your business card. But there are a lot of really interesting job titles
Every one
there
of those was something interesting.
that I don't think students would ever think of or consider for themselves. So the goal here is, just career exposure and letting students know what jobs are actually out there. And you'll see some of these pay incredibly well.
They really do.
Even to be a forest technician with an associate degree, earning a median salary over $38,000, I think will resonate with a lot of students. And you'll see these are all high demand, high paying careers because of that renewed focus on sustainability in the forestry industry. And technology is also starting to play a much bigger role in
Right.
forestry.
Yes.
So those are the types of jobs that are in high demand. And I think the jobs that students are interested in is making a difference for the environment is something kids are always very passionate
Yes.
about, as well
Especially
as
today.
integrating technology to make things more
Right.
efficient. So I think those are careers that will appeal to a lot of kids. So then our next article is the cover story, and it's the first geology article. And here we were able to interview a gentleman named Jeremy Hoffman, and he is the climate and earth scientist for the Science Museum of Virginia. So if you think about your local science centers, science museums, they probably have someone like Jeremy working there to do research, to plan educational opportunities for students, and make learning fun.
Right.
Science centers and places like those do not thrive unless they have really engaging,
Yes.
interactive
Yes.
activities for students to explore.
That's part of the coolest part of them is all the different creative ways they can get you engaged. Science
Exactly.
is very fascinating.
Because if a science center or museum feels like a classroom, there's not really a lot of incentive for
No,
students
there's
to
not.
want to go there on a field trip or with their families. So I think a lot of his job is focused on how to get kids excited about the environment, about learning, about geology specifically. So what I thought was really interesting about Jeremy is that he actually has a background in improv.
Right.
And he cites that background as, really helping him do his job better.
Yeah.
And I think as teachers, we all know that teaching is part content knowledge and part entertainment. You're kind of
That's
putting
true.
on a show every day,
Yeah.
whether you want to be or not.
Right.
We go to great lengths to get our students engaged and keep them there. So I think for teachers, that's not surprising at all. But for students to see that he could somehow integrate his background in improv and comedy
Mhm.
with a job as a climate and earth scientist is really surprising.
Yeah.
So what I found fascinating in addition to that background was how he was interested in geology in the first place. So he has memories of being on a riding mower with his grandfather as they had to dodge giant pink boulders in his grandfather's yard.
Yeah.
And he was very interested in why they were there,
Right.
how they got to be there, and basically the science behind glaciers and things like that.
Mhm.
And that was really the foundation. And I think students can really relate to that, where there's something that they see in their everyday environment that most people overlook or don't bother to notice or think
Right.
about, that really resonates with them and sparks some curiosity, which is something that I know teachers try to do every day, is to make the mundane or the ordinary feel interesting and help
Yeah.
kids see the mechanisms behind those things that we all kind of take for granted. So in the lesson plan that goes along with this article, it's called Displaying Data Sets, and basically students are broken into groups and do research about different data sets that could give us clues to climate change or the climate history of the Earth. And each group picks a different data set to research and present, and they are challenged to present it in kind of an entertaining, stand in front of the room and talk kind of a way, just like Jeremy does at the museum, and make something interactive and engaging for their classmates to participate in. So not only do they present their findings from their data set, but just like the other lesson plan we talked about, they have to justify why they chose that data set to research and why their data set is the best representation of climate change. So again, trying to help teachers focus on that justification, the building a logical argument section of the math practices. So then our other geology article, we interviewed a gentleman named Denny Capps, who actually lives in Alaska and works at Denali Nature Preserve or National Park. National Park.
Yeah.
So again, I think too often we think about geologists as being in a lab and you have a little hammer and you chip away at rock for some reason.
I just thought of rocks. Like, I literally just thought of rocks.
There's so much more to it than that. So he got his start volunteering with a research student at Yellowstone. And through that process and that experience, kind of really honed what he wanted to do.
And Alaska is a great place to do it.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. He focuses on paleoclimatology, which is basically climate science based on what you can find in the earth. So whether it be rocks, specifically fossils, things like that, to get an idea of what the climate changes have been in the past and what is happening in our climate today and in the future. He does talk a little bit about the harsh setting of Alaska and how it requires some ingenuity on his part sometimes to be able to get the samples that he needs when there's a permafrost issue or a glacier in the way, and things like that. Things that, again, I don't think any of us stop to ever think about what challenges that climate could bring over other areas. But his story is a really interesting one. And I think as a park geologist, his role is research as well as informing people and communicating those findings to park rangers and to people that are visiting the park and appreciate not only its natural beauty, but what it can teach us about the earth. And then after that come the geology job spreads. And again, there's so much more than just being a geologist in geology. So a field seismologist to me was one that stood out. Someone who actually looks at seismic records and seismic events and thinks about predicting earthquakes and the effects that they'll have, as well as a lot of jobs in the energy sector, which is something, again, that I had never thought about. So the most interesting job title on this one for me is mudlogger, which sounded to me like a very messy job.
It does, and it really stands out, too.
Whenever I first reached it, but it's actually someone who keeps logs of the mud that comes out of wells as companies are drilling, and needs to be very aware of the feedback that they're getting from that data to see if they're drilling efficiently, if they're drilling in the right place, if they're using the right equipment and things like that. So a mudlogger is not someone who trudges through the mud, which was what I thought they did.
Sure, that would make sense.
But someone who actually logs samples
also makes sense
of mud and other debris that come out of well sites. So then we close with a look at hydroponics, and we interviewed a young lady named Rochelle who is new to the hydroponics industry and is actually working as a production assistant at a hydroponic farm. And she's kind of working her way up through and learning the ropes. So it was really interesting to interview someone who wasn't as established in an industry as we typically interview. And if you look at her picture, I think students will be able to relate very well with her because you can see she is not much older than the students in your classroom are right now. So seeing someone who's actually out in the world of work, fairly fresh out of high school. She has not yet earned a degree, and is just kind of learning the ropes and working her way through is really interesting. And I think the background on hydroponics overall that she was able to provide some insight about is really interesting. So hydroponics is obviously growing plants in water and nutrients instead of soil. So you would think that it would use more water than typical agricultural methods, but actually plants aren't in water all the time. Some are actually displayed upside down with their roots in the air so that the nutrient solution can be sprayed right on the roots. Other times they use a system of pipes to deliver the water and nutrients on a very, very strict schedule to make sure that the plants are getting exactly what they need to grow and thrive. And I think as our agricultural land availability continues to shrink and places are being over-farmed, which means that they're stripped of the minerals, so we can't really grow produce there anymore. We'll start to see a lot more hydroponics growing, because in places that don't have steady access to water, this is a very valid form of agriculture that uses less water, less nutrients, and I think it's still in its infancy, but has come such a long way in a really short period of time. But I really believe that jobs in hydroponic agriculture specifically will be in very high demand moving forward, just because we're seeing a lot of issues with traditional agriculture, fertilizer runoff, insecticide runoff, things like that, that are, impacting the health of the people and animals around farms, and hydroponics might be one of the solutions to that issue. So then if you take a look at the hydroponics job spread, again, there's anything from a nursery or irrigation technician that requires, a high school diploma plus some training or an associate degree, all the way up to an agricultural engineer. And I feel like we talk about this all the time. I have to laugh when a student says, "Oh, I'm going to be an engineer," because there are so many different types of engineers. So it's kind of like saying, "I'm going to be a scientist." Yeah. Well, that's great, but you need to be a little bit more specific.
And it just continues to grow. There's
absolutely,
as everything else changes in the world, so does the engineering career, and you've got to cover it all.
Absolutely. So that's why we try really hard to showcase the different types of engineers that are out there, because students really need to have kind of a more narrow view of which part of engineering they would like to explore, whether it be chemical or agricultural or civil, industrial. There are so many different types, and if they don't have kind of a little bit of focus to that engineer career path, then they might flounder whenever they go to school, because they're not sure where to focus their studies. So I think job exposure is incredibly key. And then related to that, we actually have students explore hydroponics in a really meaningful way, I think, to kind of change their views of what gardening and hydroponics actually looks like in action. So this is one of the lesson plans you wrote, Jill, so I'll let you talk about it.
Oh, that really covers it. Like, it was, I really thought about trying to do the hydroponics themselves, experiment with it. But it is something that gets to be costly, and it obviously takes a lot of time. So we did do that as an elaboration if you wanted to go ahead and experiment with that. But mostly it does a lot of research. What is hydroponics? How can it be useful? Are there certain areas of the country or of the world where it makes more sense to do it this way versus that way? And it was really based in a lot of research and exploration, and then have students kind of build off of that, work in pairs and design their own hydroponic farm. And they don't actually have to produce anything, but kind of do research and understanding as to how that farm would work, and what kind of costs go into it, and what kind of math you have to use, and what kind of formulas to help your product grow. So it was based on a lot of research for something like you said, because it's really in its infancy, so really something to understand better. But I didn't know a lot about hydroponics going into it either. That was something that I was very unfamiliar with. So even for me, I had to do a lot of research as to what is this, how do we do it, where does it go? So I found that to be useful to go that route. And I thought it could be useful for students to go that route as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that's something that's key for teachers as they think about all of the lesson plans and the articles here, is you don't have to be a subject matter expert on every single thing that you talk about. It's totally okay to say, I don't know, let's find out together, and do those explorations with their students. And in fact, I think those are learning experiences that will stick with them much longer than the time that you lectured exhaustively about a subject that you already knew a lot about.
One of my favorite things to do as I do research for these lesson plans really is to find the videos, which I realize, may not be the best part for everybody else or may not be helpful, but I get so much information out of, somebody explaining, well, this is my field and this is what I do with this. And sometimes they have just the most creative ways to approach those. And I spend a lot of time just watching those unnecessarily, but I find them to be very helpful.
In your background knowledge and what you're able to explore with students. So I think that's one thing I would like all of our teachers to take away from this, is that, it's okay not to know. And it's okay to make those discoveries with your students, and
great to make those discoveries.
And to let their inquiry and their curiosity guide those discoveries. Too often, we have our scope and sequence set for the entire year, and we know exactly right now, if you asked me what I would be teaching on February 3rd at 10 a.m. And it's great to be organized and to have a plan. However, when there's real, genuine student interest and genuine curiosity, that's a learning opportunity that we need to be ready to embrace. And it's okay not to know everything about the subject yet, but to explore it with your students and gain that knowledge together. So that wraps it up for the late fall edition of the magazine. Thank you for joining us. In the next issue, we're continuing with the ABCs of STEM, and we're looking at intelligence, jewelry, kinetics, and law. So again, trying to combine the industries that students are passionate about with industries that they might think they already know about and have written off, and hopefully changing their minds about some of the opportunities in those industries. So thank you again.
And did you want to talk about the career lesson?
Oh, I did. Thank you. So we talked about the lesson plans that came in your toolkit in print. Thank you so much for reminding me. But please don't forget that there are also the digital lesson plans available online. So if you need the middle school versions, maybe you feel like your students aren't ready for some of the activities in the high school, you can, the beautiful thing about the 5E model is that you can kind of take a piece from each and put together your own lesson plan that works for your students and for their ability levels and what they're ready for. But if you are looking for the career exploration lesson plan specifically, it is available online. So if you want to walk students through that career exploration activity that we do with every issue, the guidance can be found right online. And if you don't have the link or can't find it, it should have been in the lesson, or excuse me, in a letter in your toolkit. If not, please just email us at info@stemjobs.com and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.